Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. My guest this week is Chief Constable Jo Shiner. Jo's the Chief Constable of Sussex Police, has been in that role since July 2020. I've had the privilege of getting to know her quite well since she's been in that position. And she's the first female Chief Constable in the history of Sussex Police. Jo's a lifelong police officer, having had a career of over 30 years. She started out in Norfolk in 1993, served up to the rank of Chief Superintendent there, and then she moved to Kent as an Assistant Chief Constable before actually joining Sussex Police in late 2018, initially as the Deputy Chief. She's been involved in just about every role you can see in the police, really, in firearms, in public order, in critical incident command. And as a Chief Constable, she has a national role on the National Police Chiefs Council, where she's the lead for roads policing. As a senior female leader in the UK police, I thought it was a really valuable interview to have, to be able to meet and talk to someone who's at the forefront of a very challenging area of our society in a really senior leadership role. And so it proved. It was a brilliant interview. I really hope you enjoy what follows, because I think she presents some fascinating insights into leadership and the challenges of policing more widely as well. So I hope you enjoy. Great. Well, Jo, welcome. It's an absolute delight to have you on. I know you're a really busy person. I'm very privileged to have you on the podcast. So thanks very much indeed for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
No, not at all. I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to you. I mean, obviously, I know you quite well, but you've had an amazing career in the police. Getting all the way to Chief Constable, a whole sort of raft of different responsibilities along the way. And you've also got some big national responsibilities these days. And I think just for our listeners' benefit, could you actually just give a sort of short summary of your career to date, as it were?
Yeah, of course. I was born and bred in Norfolk, and I began my career in Norfolk, so 21 years. That covered a number of different disciplines and specialisms, from child protection to response, all sorts of different things. At one point, I headed up the specialist operations there, which was a real privilege and very interesting. And then I moved across as an assistant chief constable to Kent, which was very different, incredibly busy. I was there during the period of OPSTAC, as it was then, so all of the lorries on the motorways, as most people know it for. And then went from Kent to Sussex as the Deputy Chief Constable at the back end of 2018, and then got promoted to Chief Constable. And alongside that, I've also had the national portfolio for roads policing. I have previously had the national portfolio for children and young people, and other bits and bobs along the way. So I do feel that I've been incredibly privileged to have had and continue to have such a varied and exciting career, really.
No, it's fantastic, and really, really great to see the sort of progression along the way. How difficult, just before we move on a bit, is it to balance national stuff with local stuff? I mean, clearly being a chief constable of any force is a big responsibility, and I'm aware, obviously, it's a pretty standard thing that you'll have spread across the various chiefs. You've got all these national responsibilities, but is that a real challenge in terms of sharing your time?
Yeah, that's right. So every chief constable and most chief officers will have a national portfolio, and it is quite challenging. They are quite demanding, and depending upon which one you have, but also depending on what's going on at the time. So if there is something nationally which touches on your portfolio, or indeed needs you to lead it, then of course that can be very time consuming, alongside, as you say, the day job, if you like, of actually running a force like Sussex. Having said that, it's also really great to be able to be involved at the national level and to be able to influence some of that policy and some of those tactics. I like particularly to get out with my road policing units across Sussex so that I can combine what's actually happening on the front line with informing my national portfolio. So I try to get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And I guess having a portfolio like roads, given everything that's going on in terms of discussion around roads, from electric vehicles to obviously accident prevention, smart motorways, all the things that just make the news. That's not a quiet portfolio, I'm guessing.
It's definitely not a quiet portfolio. And you're right, it's probably one of these portfolios that grows and develops every single day. So the whole automatic vehicles to speed limits, which are very much in the news at the moment, particularly the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit debate, across to driver training, legislation, sentencing, everything really. It's a hugely diverse portfolio and one that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I bet. We could probably have a whole separate discussion about 20-mile-an-hour speed limits and self-driving vehicles and things like that. Having been a previous owner of a Tesla and seen kind of where that technology is heading. But going back to the very beginning then, so what was it that motivated you to ultimately join the police, and how did you kind of prepare for that? What did you do that set yourself up for success in the police?
So originally, I actually aimed for a military career. My father was in the RAF for many, many years. He was actually bomb disposal in the RAF for many years, and my mother was a teacher. And I aimed to go into the military, into the army. And then for personal reasons at the last minute wasn't able to do that, and therefore still wanted to very much serve the public. That's what I've been brought up with. And so I joined Norfolk Police at the time. And it's really interesting that when I look at the priorities that I've had the privilege of setting as a chief, so protecting communities, capturing criminals and delivering an outstanding service, those priorities actually came from not only what I believed, if you like, before I joined the police, but also those that were instilled into me by my tutor and by my sergeants when I first joined. It's about looking after the good people. It's about catching the bad people and about making sure that we deliver that outstanding service to victims and witnesses. So I find myself almost 31 years now into my policing career, having developed and changed hugely in many areas, but with those three very, very clear priorities and reasons for being. I guess you'd describe them as exactly the same as they were 31 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. But I guess the role has changed significantly in that 31 years. And I mean, particularly, when you joined all those years ago, female police officers must have been much more of a rarity, and you must have had some significant challenges along that way, have you not?
Yeah, very, very much so. There were far fewer female officers joining then than there are now. And in fact, when I first joined, I was issued with a skirt, a handbag, and a tiny little wooden truncheon that fitted in the handbag. So it was a very different world to that we enjoy now. And I'm always very proud of the fact that I still have my skirt that I was issued when I joined, and it still fits. That's always my measure. I don't need scales. I just need the skirt that I joined with. But of course, it's changed hugely. We didn't have body-worn video camera. There was very little CCTV even in those days. We didn't have the protective stab vests. We didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have mobile data terminals. So much has changed in policing along that time, along obviously with the challenges that I think we're increasingly seeing in society as well.
Yeah, and just on that societal point before we move on, I mean, I think when I was a youngster, respect for not just the police, actually respect for teachers and kind of anyone that was in authority was completely different to where it is now. And I sort of see, maybe it's just because I'm getting old and crotchety, but I do think that that must be a real challenge now, the kind of attitude that some members of society and some sections of society have towards authority generally, actually, but the police specifically, and the horns of the dilemma that puts you on when you're trying to manage obviously a very litigious world where you're not the only ones with cameras, everyone's filming you, and everything gets replayed and plays out over social media and all those sorts of things. That must be another significant change and challenge over the time you've been in policing.
I mean, particularly the advent of mobile phones and videoing everything, and being always in the spotlight, particularly for our frontline officers, is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because whilst I think there can always be a negative lens on some of those, it's the negative ones that actually reach the media. There's also a huge amount of benefits in terms of particularly body-worn video cameras when it comes to complaints, and also protecting officers at the time. So society is very, very different to that it was 30 years ago. I think what is important to remind ourselves of, though, is that when I joined, I can remember those officers on my shift who already had 28, 29 years service then, and they probably made the same observations about, the youngsters that were joining policing then and society as it was, as we now make about, those officers and how different they are in terms of attitudes and everything. So I do think it is a case of evolving. And I do think that it is really important to remember that, because there is also some really, really good things that are happening in policing at the moment. And we've got some bright and brilliant young people joining who, of course, are part of our society as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a very, very fair point. That obviously you look differently as you join. I mean, in fact, looking at my sort of former military career and talk about that quite regularly, that the Air Force of today is a very different one to the one I joined. But actually, for people joining the Air Force of today, they're looking at through a different set of lenses than the ones I've got. So my kind of revisionist history perhaps is not relevant to them at all, and I totally get that. And your evolution point is a great segue into my next question, because looking at a podcast all about leadership, I'm very interested in leadership styles, and particularly for senior people, how you've adapted, evolved, developed your own leadership style as you've moved through different roles, got more senior, seen those changes in society that we've just been talking about, and so on. How's that shifted for you? What's your perspective?
So I have always tried to bring myself to work. I've always tried to bring the best version of myself to work. I'm a huge believer in authenticity. I'm a huge believer that if you try to be something that you're not, then it ends in a lot of stress and a lot of pressure and probably outcomes that you wouldn't want. So that's probably what I try to do mostly, is to make sure that I am a me at work. But I'm also a hugely reflective person, and I recognise that the whole of me isn't necessarily always going to be a bonus in every single situation. And so I've learned over the years to try to adapt as much as I can to make sure that I know my audience, that I know my business, that I know what we want to achieve for the greater good of the public or for my workforce or for whatever we're doing in any particular meetings or audiences, and therefore to adapt that. And I think there is a real skill, and one that I'm definitely still learning, in making sure that you remain yourself, that you are authentic, but that you also have a style which achieves what you want to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I found myself that, shifting, trying to be the same person. I don't know about you, but I look at myself and think, well, I'm still the 21-year-old me. I don't feel much different to your skirt a minute ago. Sadly, my uniform from when I was then doesn't quite fit, I don't think now, but it's pretty close. But I do think that reflecting yourself on what would I have thought of this when I was young is actually quite a useful thing I do as well, because some of the time that gives me a lens to look through that says, yeah, okay, maybe I should handle this slightly differently and I think particularly when you look at in the corporate world, where obviously I spend a lot of my time working these days, is societal changes have been huge, and the sort of Gen Z element of society and the way they want to work and the way they want to behave, adapt themselves to the sort of modern world is totally different, and you have to find a way as a senior leader to recognize that and be embracing what they bring, as well as potentially harnessing and herding them in the right direction where you need to. So I totally share that. If you look backwards then at where you've come from, and you were advising school-age Joe, who's thinking about a career in policing and or the military at that stage, what would you be saying across the time that you've learned everything you've learned?
I think the most important thing is to believe in yourself and to believe that if you do have integrity and that you're confident that the direction that you're trying to influence is the right one for the greater good, then understanding that might sometimes be a really hard path and that you might need to keep that belief when times get tough. Because sometimes I think, and particularly honestly, as a female sort of in through that promotion journey, there have been times where it's been really tough. And there have been times where others have created self-doubt, I guess, the whole imposter syndrome, where you need to remind yourself that actually you probably can do this. And the fact that others are persuading you not to is probably the reason why you should do that as well.
No, again, great point. And on that kind of the more positive side of that, role models, who have you really kind of looked at and followed, and who has shaped your career in that sense?
I mean, I was incredibly fortunate to grow up with a mum and dad who were really hardworking, and taught me very much, those standards, and really instilled in me that in order to achieve, you have to work hard and you have to put the time in. And that whilst you might get a bit of luck along the way, most of it is going to be achieved as a result of having integrity, making sure you treat people properly, and actually working hard. My late father had a brilliant expression that success is preparation meeting opportunity. And I've always lived by that, because if you do put the work in, if you do that preparation, then the right opportunities come along and you're ready for them in every aspect. And therefore, you'll be successful, whatever success looks like for you. So I was very lucky to have both my mother and father as role models. Just recently, Jake Humphrey is definitely my number one role model. I think that the podcasts that he does around leadership are really, really insightful. And the reason I have so much respect for him is because he is brutally honest about himself and about when he struggles, and about the fact that actually it's not all glossy and good news all of the time, despite obviously him being very public facing. And I think they're really, really excellent sort of leadership points, if you like, and human points that he makes.
Oh, yeah, great. No, that's really helpful. I actually haven't listened to his podcast. I'll give it a listen. I think the ones that, to your authenticity point, where people are prepared to be sort of bare their souls a little bit, and it's really helpful, because it does bring a much more kind of, oh yeah, actually I can sympathize with that, because I've been in exactly, it almost gives you permission to feel the same way in some way when you hear some of these people who have been very successful. I totally agree. I think that's really useful. Your preparation meets opportunity. But interestingly, I interviewed David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, for this, and he said luck, because he said lots of people have said Petraeus has been lucky, and he said I have been lucky, but luck in my experience is where preparation meets opportunity, and so exactly this, and I agree. I think it's a great analogy, because it does does actually show that if you've done the work to get the preparation done, and you then make sure you're available for the right opportunities, then guess what? You might actually be in the right place. Like I can't remember who it was who said it. That was one of the sportsmen that sometime said that the more I play, the luckier I get. When people were saying he was lucky, and that's also true, I think, because obviously if you've got that kind of huge depth of experience over time, that makes a massive difference for sure.
I think so, and I think a really good example of that is, I speak about it quite openly, that my father was killed when I was a teenager on the roads. It was after he'd retired from the RAF, and he was on his way to work one morning, and he was killed. And of course it had a profound impact on me. But what it did was to really point me in the direction of when I came into policing, of doing everything that I could in order to address anything on the roads, to reduce those people who are killed and seriously injured. And of course, having had the opportunity and worked up the ranks, quite naturally, when the portfolio of road policing came along, it was such a privilege and a real watershed moment for me to be able to now lead that road safety portfolio, knowing with that lived experience what a difference it can make to families if we actually get it right. And of course, reduce those people who then, don't have to live through what our families lived through. And that's a really good example, I think, of actually those things do come along. And as long as you've prepared the ground and you're in a position to be able to grab them and make the most of them, then hopefully, you can do some good.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. I mean, and I can only imagine. I'm very sorry to hear about your dad. I mean, as you know from our previous conversations, my father died when I was very young as well, and it's always a shame, I think, because I've often reflected on what my dad actually have thought of what I achieved, during my career, and you must have the same. I mean, I'm in no doubt whatsoever. He would be enormously proud of what you've achieved, and actually particularly given that kind of poignancy around and what you're now doing with roads policing. That's an amazing accolade to you. Mm. Switching tack just a little bit to look at traits, leadership traits. You obviously have a lot of people working for you. You've seen a lot of people in other forces and in bits of government that you're obviously closely engaged with, and local authorities, et cetera, et cetera. What are the leadership traits that you consider are most important? And I kind of traits and values, I suppose, and things. I'm not really thinking just about stuff that for you, but also for those around you. What do you want to see in people that are working for you or around you?
I think honesty and integrity have to be fundamentally central to everything, because without honesty and integrity, people probably wouldn't believe that you're going to do something that you say you're going to do. So they're really the baseline upon which I think that leadership should sit. I think a willingness to speak up for yourself and for others who might not have the voice that you have is really powerful as well. And I always look for people who do that for others, because I think it shows not just self-confidence, but I also think that it shows some really deep emotional intelligence. I also think the ability to reflect and to accept when one is wrong is very important as well, because there is no doubt at all, and particularly with the complexity of policing, but also with government, wider politics, everything else in this society at the moment, there are no right or wrong answers. And often, I know from a personal perspective, I'll have quite strong views on something, and I won't always get things right. And I think the ability to reflect and think, yeah, actually, I do think that others had a really good point there. And then to have the humility to say, you were right and I was wrong, and we need to set that back in the right direction is incredibly important.
No, great. Such a powerful point. And humility I think, is a critical aspect of senior leadership, and sadly lacking in rather too many as well. The honesty and integrity, I mean, obviously as a police officer, I would absolutely have expected those to be very high on your list. And I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because you are in a profession where that is taken by most people as a given, that you would expect that in the police, and therefore it's that much more damaging when it isn't there. And I can really see, and I feel for you and all your colleagues actually in some of the things that have gone recently, where obviously the police have been found wanting in a number of areas and banged to rights in many ways, and that must be quite difficult for you personally, and also all the sort of the people around you, to kind of keep the faith, as it were, from a professional point of view when you see some of that, is it?
Hugely. But what I do know is that there are far, far more good and great people in policing than there are those people who not only do we see the headlines around, but of course, as a chief, I sack during hearings. And so it is really important to remember that the vast majority of people, 99.9%, actually join because they want to do good. And it's up to us to make sure that we drive out those people who are dishonest, who don't have integrity, or who have joined for the wrong reasons. But I think it's important as a leader to be an optimist, whilst also respecting hugely the immense sadness and professional disappointment that some of those tragic cases have brought over the last couple of years particularly.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very fair answer. And as I say, I really, I've felt for you on a number of occasions where I just think it's got to be really tough because, as you say, it's always the case that it's not the whole barrel that's rotten. It's the few apples that are in there that are rotten, which, if you're not careful, can contaminate other things and other people. So you do have to be pretty robust in terms of dealing with it. And I think that's good to see that that's actually starting to happen more. And I don't think it's helped. And candidly, I mean, I could probably say this, you might not want to, that I don't think you as a police service have been helped by, in some instances, government and certainly, very vocal people in the media who are all too quick to put damaging allegations, damaging statements out without real foundation and substance about the whole system. And language matters in this space. And I think that's really difficult to deal with. And, you see reports obviously come out, some of which have got some pretty, particularly about the Met, have had some very, very robust language that has got to be difficult. And I think, not least recruitment, it becomes a challenge then because you get a parental gateway issue and those sorts of things that starts to play into all of that. So, yeah, keep doing what you're doing, I think. Because I think it's it's a really, really got to be tough when some of that starts to play through. And hopefully, like a lot of things in life, it's a bit of a pendulum swing, and the pendulum's quite a long way over at the moment, and it's going to swing back to something resembling a more central position at some point before too long.
I think, though, particularly those reports that have come out around policing that have no doubt rightfully knocked public confidence. I think it is really important that we do learn from those, though. And of course, you might not agree with every word of them, but there is no doubt that there are some behaviours, not just in policing, it goes across probably all services, all companies, society, doesn't it? That we do need to look at a bit harder, where there does need to be greater scrutiny, there needs to be greater awareness. And we need to make sure that we are really promoting and supporting brave leadership at all levels that can really call it out and really challenge, whether it's misogyny, whether it's sexism, whether it's racism, whatever those behaviours are. We need to make sure that we're empowering our workforce to call that out.
And how successful is that? Do you think that we are getting better in terms of empowerment and, for one, but also then actually creating the conditions where your officers feel prepared to turn around and call stuff out? They may well be empowered to do it and they may well be encouraged to do it, but there's a difference between that and them doing it.
So we're definitely seeing an increase in terms of people being prepared to do that and to accept less. And I think that's really healthy. Having said that, I would never want to be confident that we have rooted it out to any extent, because of course you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. I think as a leader, all you can try to do is to develop, build, sustain that culture where you make it as easy as you possibly can for those behaviours to be called out, and for the people who do to know that it will be treated properly, it will be investigated fairly, all of those things that you would expect. So I think leadership is about creating the culture and encouraging the behaviours. And then there has to be an element of choice for those people. Yeah,
I completely agree. Interestingly, I was the safeguarding. I was a school governor for Christ Hospital at Horsham, which is my old school anyway, for 8 years. In one of the things I did as part of that role was I was the safeguarding governor for quite a long time. And one of the things I would always say to the safeguarding lead in the school is pretty much exactly what you've just said. Look, we can never be 100% confident that there are not significant issues here, but it is absolutely about creating the right conditions. And I think, interestingly, the thing that has changed hugely in probably the last 20 years, certainly if you go back further than that, the overall change is even greater, is an attitude from in that instance, the children, to speak up when stuff's not right, and and actually to be prepared to to call stuff out in a way that would never have happened when I was a kid. So, and I think if you translate that into wider sections of society, including the ones you're dealing with, I think that's great. Do you see the same thing? Interestingly, do you see the same thing from the public point of view to police in terms of reporting crime and allegations of crime and so on? Has that shifted markedly over your career?
It's definitely shifted markedly. I think if you look at it, it's much more complex, though, about culture. I think it's also about technology. So again, 31 years ago, people didn't have mobile phones where they could call stuff in, where they could see it, they couldn't record it. A lot of the shops would have had CCTV, etc., etc. So I think the advent of immediate technology, as I call it, has hugely influenced what people report and how they report it. But I also do think that the public are far better, or society is better at calling it out when not just police, but also other public bodies are getting it wrong. And that's really helpful. And I think that as organisations, whilst there'll always be a few, that might not be quite accurate, actually, we should always be open to investigating and to looking at some of those challenges which the public raise, because that's the only way in which we're going to be able to improve our services. And I think to have a mindset that is different to that is tricky.
Yeah, no, again, it makes super sense. I think the technology and things interesting. Does the advent of more technology in the world, for the public world now, mobile phones for one, CCTV, etc., present extra pressure for you because obviously you see a lot of stuff in the media reporting about frustration about the police don't investigate this, they don't, they've got enough manpower to go and do this. And, burglaries would be a great example of that, where lots of people are very grumpy about it. And obviously at the same time, you see the kind of evidence presented in terms of CCTV images or mobile phone footage or whatever. Has that collision of worlds created more problems for you than it's solved, or overall is it net positive?
I wouldn't like to say whether it's a net positive or not. I mean, it definitely creates opportunities in terms of evidence, but it also creates a huge amount of complex and increased workload in terms of evidence as well. So, for example, previously when I was a DS on the child protection unit, you wouldn't consider, when you were investigating a rape or other serious sexual offence, you wouldn't consider the text messages or WhatsApps that had gone on between, teenagers or subjects or others, because they simply didn't exist then. Whereas now, of course, a lot of the evidence, particularly that might undermine or support a prosecution case, a lot of it is on computers or is on phones. And so the ability to be able to secure that digital evidence forensically is really quite complex. So I think that there are challenges and opportunities all the way through. And I think as other technology develops in terms of how we gather that evidence, then I think that the future will be far better for the technological advancements. We're probably in a slightly clunky time of just making sure that policing is absolutely keeping up to speed in terms of that, particularly as quite a lot of it's expensive investment.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And interestingly, I was at a presentation the other day talking about artificial intelligence and where that might take us. And the guy that was doing it was a pretty eminent futurist who spends his life looking at the future and what it's going to be. And he was talking, and I think it was the first presentation I've actually seen where I actually understood most of what he was talking about. And he was saying that in almost every walk of life, that the thing that's going to happen next is there'll be a kind of AI companion that aids you in the workforce. And he presented a very interesting chart where he said, if you're at the bottom end in terms of capability and you add AI to it, it'll take you up to being entirely credible and capable. Obviously, if you're at the top end, if you're a really capable individual anyway, it's going to make you superhuman. It's going to really turn around and transform what you do. And I can particularly see in your kind of world some of what you just described around evidence shifts and those sorts of things, evidence sifts would be really powerful, be really valuable to have that ability to turn around and weed through stuff much quicker and all the rest of it. That's a much bigger digression than I planned to on policing. I do apologise. I'm just fascinated by the changes and transition that we've gone down. But turning back to you and looking at your sort of leadership profile and career, I try and talk a little bit about highs and lows because inevitably that they're interesting for all sorts of obvious reasons. But when you look right back across the whole of your policing career, what do you kind of reflect on and wish you'd done differently, and why?
I definitely wished I'd been a dog handler. As you know, my love for dogs is unsurpassed, really, or any animals come to that. And it's probably one of my biggest regrets is that I didn't become a dog handler during my career. However, I haven't really got any other regrets. I think I've been incredibly fortunate to have enjoyed a career, which of course it's been challenging, of course it's been difficult at times. Actually, there isn't a single day of my career that I haven't looked forward to coming to work, and I still feel the same 31 years into it as I did the day I joined. And so I consider myself incredibly lucky to have had a career like that. But yeah, definitely been a dog handler.
Yeah, the dog handlers. When one of the jobs I did a long time ago in the MOD, I had a team working on cyber actually, and they were working out at Cheltenham at GCHQ. And one of the guys we'd put in there because we'd done some aptitude testing and pieces to put the right people in there. And this guy was an RAF police dog handler, and and he'd done 2-3 years, I think, in this new role in GCHQ, which was absolutely cutting edge stuff that I won't go into the detail. And the RAF posting system then said, right, we need him back to be a dog handler. I'm going, you what? Don't be serious. He's one of like half a dozen people who've got this skill set that we've now been developing. We can't possibly put him back to being a dog handler. But that's a great one to wish you'd done. What do you consider is your most individually now your most important achievement so far? And as you start to look, I mean, obviously, you've got a while left of your career yet, I'm sure, but in terms of impact, legacy, if you want to use the word, those sorts of things, what would make you happy? Because much like you just said, you haven't had a day when you've not enjoyed going to work. I think that's so important. I was incredibly lucky when I was in the Air Force. I felt exactly the same. I mean, clearly I had some highs and lows, but every single job I did across a 34-year career, I loved it, and that's I think the best you can ever get out of life if you're in that position. So, we're both very fortunate to having had that. But the high point within that, and what do you want to be remembered for? I suppose.
So I think what would I like to be remembered for? I'd like to be remembered as a chief who really, truly cares and appreciates those people who come into policing, knowing how difficult it is, particularly those who serve on the front line, who literally do not know what they are facing every day and who work relentlessly to keep the public safe. I do think that we don't celebrate and appreciate as a society the huge and very brave role that our frontline officers and staff do. So I think that's really important. And I try my best to get out and about. I'm still blues and twos trained. I'm still what I call ninja trained, but I think it's personal safety training. So still baton trained and handcuff trained and everything. Because for me, I'm still very much a warranted police officer. Even though I'm the Chief Constable, I'm still a constable, just with the word chief in front of it. And so I definitely like my legacy to be one where people think of me still as an operational officer who tries their best to understand those challenges, particularly on the front line, and to try to serve, if you like, that front line as much as I can to make sure that the policies and everything else that we do in the boardroom actually has at 2:00 in the morning, it makes sense, works for those people who are doing a really difficult job. I think in terms of, if you like, my high point, it has to be some of those victims and some of those court cases where we've had to fight really, really, really hard for justice. Very early on in my career, again, when I was in the Child Protection Unit, I remember a case coming in that was related to serving social worker. And of course, this was, 25 years ago now. So it was before, if you like, a lot of the recognition that people in power would commit those offences or the acknowledgement that they do so. and it was really difficult to get people on board for that investigation at the time. But in the end, that person, that social worker, went guilty, and we secured justice for quite a number of young girls who had been sexually abused by him. And it taught me a huge lesson that you really, really must keep driving and striving to get the right result and to get justice. So I think I will always remember that case, along with a number of others, and also some of the more fun stuff that I've had to do as a chief officer. So I was very privileged to meet the Queen on the day where I believe she became the longest reigning monarch. That was when I was in Kent. And that was a very, very proud moment for me. Particularly, I'd previously, worked in Norfolk, where Sandringham is based. So there are so many points in my career where I've looked around me and thought, I am really, really lucky, not just to be in a position to get justice for victims, but just lucky to do this job, really.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I've been lucky enough to go out with the police a few times, particularly when I was still in the military. And I vividly remember when, it's a long time ago, it was 1997, I was on staff college, and we went to Scotland Yard in its old location. And we had a session in the central headquarters, and then we split up into small groups. And I think it was 2 or 3 of us went to Leytonstone in northeast London, so one of the nicer boroughs where there was plenty of activity to go and observe. And we arrived in the division. We had a bit of a briefing, and then we were waiting for people cars to come in for us to then go out. And we went out for 4 or 5 hours with a couple of cops on patrol. And I think I did 5 blue light calls that night. I think every single one of them was domestic abuse. And one of them I will never forget, because the moment they took the call, they just looked at each other in the front. I was sat in the back, they looked in the front, and they went, one of our kind of regular places we're always going to. And we got there, and they drove round the block quickly, arriving obviously in blues and twos, and found a parking space underneath the building. It was one of these buildings where there was sort of you could park tucked in under the building. And I said, "Why'd you do that?" I said, "You'll see." And the next thing is we ran up the stairwell, and you can't get the sensory effect on the podcast, but I've been in some pretty interesting places in the world in the military, and some pretty dangerous places in the world. But the courage of the 2 officers on that night, it was a relatively elderly chap and a much younger lady, and they didn't know what they were going into. They weren't armed. You could hear this ruckus from the ground. It was on the 5th floor, so it was a fitness test anyway, running up the stairs to get to the 5th floor. And we arrived, and they were absolutely marvelous at calming the situation down almost instantly. I almost got arrested by the backup that turned up because they sort of saw me as a sightseer, which was quite funny. But the kind of circumstances in which they were operating and the situation in the flat that we went into, I'll never forget it. Because it was a sort of section of society that I'd never really had any dealings with at all in my own country. And it was extraordinary. So I completely agree with you. I think the courage of your officers on a daily basis in those sort of circumstances, particularly, I think, given, and again, it's probably a change you've seen very significantly over the years, the increased prevalence of gang crime, violent crime in terms of knives and other weapons and so on, where we're still an unarmed police by and large, and that must be a real challenge for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the professionalism, the tenacious will of some of our front line to make sure that they're really getting to the bottom of circumstances such as you described, which are often hugely and very highly emotionally heated. It's often not clear. There's often an unwillingness from a number of people to even want to engage with us or speak with us. It's an incredibly difficult job, and it's full on as well. It's not, that's not just, you would get several instances like that across the shift. And of course, the unknown, you go to do a routine stop on a vehicle and it doesn't stop, or it stops and then makes off. And I do think that we really, we try to celebrate the professionalism in Sussex Police. Certainly we have all of our award ceremonies and everything like that. But it isn't until you watch the bravery on some of the body-worn video footage, you listen to some of those calls that have come into the control room, and you meet those incredibly humble officers, and of course some of our police staff investigators, special constables, others who just do so much to make it better for the public and to make it safer for the public and for society generally. And truly, I take my hat off to them every single day.
No, it's great that you do celebrate that success, that's for sure. I mean, the bit of the story I didn't finish from the flat actually was the guys had parked underneath the block of flats. Of course, when we go back down to the car, the backup had turned up in another marked car, hadn't been able to get underneath the block of flats, and their car was covered in flour and eggs. And that's why they'd looked for the slot underneath the block. And again, it's just, really? I'm obviously living maybe in a kind of different bubble, but your guys see that on a very regular basis. But that was the kind of nature of the wider group in that particular environment, and you see those challenges.
You learn your street craft and your beat craft very quickly, and that's exactly what that is. You learn to be wise about what you do, where you park, who you engage with, all the rest of it very, very quickly.
I'm sure.
Into your career.
I'm sure. No question. For every high point, there's got to be a low point. What was your career low point, and what did you learn from it?
I think that the low point has got to be where you have done everything within your power to try to achieve justice, and you haven't been able to do so. And there's probably been half a dozen cases that I've investigated over the years where that has been the case. And you just know that there is nothing else that you could have done. And yet you still haven't been able to achieve justice for that victim. And they were definitely low points for me. But equally, of course, you learn something from each of those. I think as a chief, it's been really challenging sometimes when you've looked at historic investigations and seen some of them were flawed when people have complained about them, and of course making those very heartfelt and genuine apologies to families where we've got it wrong. Of course, that's a low point as well, because you do feel even though for some of these I haven't even joined policing. When the investigations happened, you still feel, or I still feel, very personally responsible for the outcome of that, even though it could well have been over 30 years ago. Because you look at it and think we could and should have done better.
Yeah, I can well imagine that, and I think it must be very frustrating for all of your officers when some of the time, and I know obviously at the end of the day, the burden of proof is on the prosecution and they've got to get it across the line, and the job of the defence is to turn around and obviously do the opposite and undermine the prosecution case and get the defendant cleared. But I can completely see why that is really, really frustrating. And I think the other thing that I often see is when the human face of policing kind of gets forgotten in a lot of this. There'll be stuff that's gone on, which is obviously harrowing for the officers involved. And yet, and particularly if the result isn't quite the right result and someone does get off or there's no solution to a particular crime or whatever, then it's the police in general that get looked at for that, rather than it being the kind of the individuals, and protecting the individuals and looking after the individuals must be a key facet of what you do now. And particularly in a world where obviously mental health is much more in focus, and PTSD is a thing. Whereas wind the clock back not that far, probably the beginning of both our careers, and it wouldn't really have been a thing in the same way that it is now. Is that right? I mean, how big a deal is that for you in terms of managing the mental health of your people?
It's incredibly important. to manage the mental health. And as you say, PTSD, I think it's really good that there is much more awareness of it. It's really good that there is much more recognition that it is something that we need to support people through and to help people through. And it, whenever I open our attestations for student officers who join us, so that's the night that they get their warrant card, I'm always very clear with them that when you become a police officer, you are going to see things, you're going to hear things, you're going to experience events that very, very few other people in society would ever do. And that just because you're a police officer, you haven't got this invisible cloak of protectiveness around you or around your mental health. And so it is really important to be honest and to speak to your colleagues and to raise it when actually you do start to think about things more than you think that you should do. And of course, there's some, there's a natural ability of the body, isn't there, to kind of process. And some people have greater resilience than others. But I definitely feel incredibly protective as a chief that I'm asking people to do a really, really difficult job, not just operationally, but also organisationally. I'm asking them to do a really, really difficult job. And therefore, it is utterly my responsibility to make sure that I look after them as much as I can.
No, brilliant. That's such a good answer. And actually quite a neat segue into my next question as well, because work-life balance, you're in a world where leaving the job at work and going home must be incredibly important. I mean, and how do you do that? What are your top tips?
So I could give you a perfect leadership answer here of the kind of work-life balance that I ought to be striving to achieve. But frankly, I don't. I, as I've said before, I feel incredibly privileged to have this role, and with it comes a huge sense of responsibility. And I think because I have a deep sense of personal ownership, personal responsibility, it is very rare for me not to, have my work mobile phone kind of glued into my pocket, if you like. And it's very rare for me to switch off. But equally, that's just me, and it would cause me more stress and anxiety probably if I didn't know what was going on than if I did. I've got a brilliant Deputy Chief Constable, and he is, when I am away, I know that the only things that, he'll call me about are ones which are really important. And then, of course, I'll have a look at a few emails, particularly national portfolio or otherwise, and sometimes deal with those when I'm off. But that's my personal choice, and it works for me, and it might not work for others. I mean, I also have learned how to make sure that I manage my own personal stress levels, if you like. Obviously, my dog, incredibly important to me. I do a lot of walking, and we live in a beautiful county in Sussex, so a lot of walking on the beach and in the downs and other ways. And for me, that works. And of course, my husband, who I probably should have put before the dog, but that never naturally seems to happen in these conversations.
I'm sure he'll forgive you.
He's used to it by now, absolutely. But he's incredibly supportive, and it would be really difficult for me to be able to do this role, which is very busy, without the support that he gives me. So for me, I think it is about making sure that when times are really tough, you do get some of that downtime, but you also recognise that, you are being paid and have been given the responsibility to do a job which is incredibly important, and therefore that's part of what it is.
Yeah, and I totally recognise that. And interestingly, when I talk, as I do quite a bit of leadership training with different organisations, I talk quite regularly about delegation, because there comes a point, I think, where middle to senior management, they suddenly, in a corporate world now, they end up in a position where they're having to do that, and they've never really learned how to do that. And they've done the job, and they're very good at the job, and they want the fingerprints all over the job, and the result. And they got to learn to let go, and they've got to empower other people to do stuff and let them get on with it. And to very much to your point, the analogy and the story I often tell is, look, to give you, it is possible to do both things. You can actually stay on top of it and actually still be good at delegation. And when I was commanding Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan, which was a huge thing, it was 25,000 people and 170 airplanes, and 20 nations and all the complexity that went with that. When I went on my first period of leave, I went for a week in Oman, actually, and my wife flew out and met me out there, and we had a lovely holiday. And I had a very good Dutch deputy commander. I said to him, look, okay, there's these things that are going on this week. There's about 4 things going on this week that you need to pay attention to, that I'm all over, and this is the handover for those. And other than that, you just get on and do it. You call me for 2 reasons. One is somebody dies, and 2 is something's going to make the international news. And otherwise, just get on with it and tell me what happened when I got back. And that's not to say that I didn't look at a single email, because I didn't want to come back and have 500 emails that I was now going to have to turn around and focus on. But I didn't respond to a single email. Because I was working on the basis that he's got to get on with it. I've got to let him deliver in that, and because that way, when he's ready, and your deputy, I'm sure, is the same. When he's ready to step up to be a chief, that he wants to be in a position he's been well prepared for that, and that's such an important facet. But at the same time, as a leader, it's particularly in that kind of organisation, and the same one, the way the force you're running. There's no way you just let it go and wander off and have 3 weeks on the beach and forget about it. That just doesn't happen, and it's unrealistic to think otherwise. But as I'm saying, sure, your husband will forgive you for putting the dog before him. But
he's entirely used to the dog coming before him. and I think the other really important element is about I've learned as I've got older how important diet is. How important it is, and there's a whole movement at the moment around ultra-processed food and unprocessed food. But goodness me, the difference that it makes if you do eat properly is incredible, in my experience, particularly if, you are doing very long hours. And so I've definitely made some changes in the last few years to cater for my growing years, it's fair to say. And of course, sport. I'm a huge believer that if you do keep yourself active, then it helps both your mental and your physical health. And it's something I really try to instill in our younger officers who are joining now, that, that neck up, neck down fitness is really, really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the diet, general well-being, just giving yourself space, actually. I mean, I posted recently about just get out for a walk, get yourself some fresh air, go in, and if you have got a dog's great for that, because it automatically gets you out to go and do something, gets you some kind of headspace that you don't otherwise have, just to turn around and declutter your mind a little bit, because otherwise it can get to the point that you're just entirely focused on the job. And again, back to another Afghanistan story. I mean, one of the things I found there was I inherited an organization, not my predecessors' fault at all. They'd been through a really busy time where everyone was working 7 days a week, 14, 15, 16 hours a day was pretty normal for an awful lot of people. And I said, we got to a slightly less stressful moment. And I said, look, stop that right now. Everybody has 1 day off, including me. I don't care which day it is. It's because obviously you've got to stagger it across the week because the base runs 24/7. But in that day off, you do not turn up to work. I don't care what you do. You can go to the gym. You can go and sit in in your accommodation and read a book. You can go and do laps around the base, whatever it is. But you don't turn up to work, because I want you to be in a position that when I need to turn the wick up on the lamp and make you burn brighter and work you harder, you have got capacity to do that. If you're already running at 100% plus, you have no capacity to do that. And again, I think it's in particularly in the more challenging world of your policing will be very similar to the military in that sense. That was so important, because otherwise you're just running everyone too hot all the time. And of course, people do burn out. Ultimately, they'll fall over, and that's an avoidable problem. We've talked quite a bit, because we digressed, my fault, into a lot of stuff about policing earlier on. But I think what I try and do with guests on my podcast is talk to their area of expertise. And clearly, you've got a huge amount of experience in policing. We've talked quite a bit about some of the things that are going on already. But when you look at the seemingly huge amount of stuff that has piled in, not least on the Met, but the Met's been kind of the lightning rod for an awful lot of it, I think, but on policing more generally, and you mentioned the public confidence expression earlier on. How do you what do you think the way forward is? How easy is it going to be to turn around and actually get that moving back in a direction where the public generally does feel more confident in the police service to respond to everything and to behave as they expect it to, and all the things that have been kind of trounced a little bit by some of the stuff that's gone on?
I still believe that the silent majority really support and appreciate what the police do. And of course that varies depending on where you are geographically, and it varies depending on your own experience. But I do still believe that the silent majority very much appreciate and trust what we do. And I think I do, try to get out to as many community groups and goodness knows, parish council meetings, you name it. I'm happy to talk to anybody about policing really. And what I do hear from people is that they're really bugged by some small things that happen, whether it's dog fouling on the pavement or speeding or antisocial behaviour. Actually, by and large, they still know that when they put the call in and something big's happening, that the police will turn out and protect them. So I think we do have to remember that, because I think that if we don't believe that, then we might as well all give up and go home, frankly. So I am optimistic about the future. I do think that we have got to make sure that we continue to do the basics well. And I think policing has possibly got a bit distracted over the last few years because of the really significant and fast development of some of the crimes, whether it's fraud, whether it's online, et cetera, et cetera. I think we've got to make sure that we are not over-promising what we can do, but that we do deliver what the public expect well and professionally. And I think if we continue to strive to do that, and as chiefs or others who have influence over the strategy, the direction in which policing is going, we try to simplify it as much as we can, then I think we stand a chance.
Yeah, I hope you're right, because I certainly subscribe to your view about the silent majority. I think there's an awful lot of people who absolutely still have kind of kept the faith and to some extent see through the haze that's generated by the media and social media in particular, and all the noise that's kind of around that, because it can whip up an absolute frenzy, obviously in a very, very short period of time. But no, fingers crossed, you're completely right. On safety of your officers, though, Jo, obviously there've been some really awful incidents. The two that immediately spring to mind are the Matt Ratana, who obviously was a Sussex guy, but even though he was a Met officer, and Andrew Harper, who, again, not in your force, but those kind of incidents where, for the world, it looks. They're clearly absolute tragedies, but they do sort of look preventable in inverted commas. Is enough being done? And are you confident enough that the government is responding in the way you want it to address the kind of safety concerns and ensure that safety is paramount? You mentioned lots of things, body-worn cameras and stab vests and all those sorts of things that you have got. But what's on the wish list, as it were, if you had a crystal, not a crystal ball, but a magic wand that you could wave and address this, what more would you do?
Well, my wish list would definitely be to have more officers and more resources, more people, because that would ultimately make it all safer, frankly. Particularly in a county which has such a significant geographical area, such as Sussex, then more officers. We're one of the lowest funded forces in the country. It's not a political point, it's a point of fact. And therefore, we have less officers sort of per population, if you like, than some of the other more affluent counties. So more officers is the obvious answer, but alongside that, police staff, investigators, etc., anything that can make us more efficient and effective. Absolutely tragic. Those deaths that you have mentioned, alongside some of the serious assaults on police officers that we see, and some of those assaults which might not be physically as hurtful, but certainly the mental impact on those officers stays with them for some time. And I raise awareness as much as I can around how important it is that the judiciary really do take seriously the impact on assaults on police officers and make sure that we are sentencing appropriately according to the impact that has had. So I think it's not just about the physical equipment. I think it's about the acknowledgement and realisation of the impact when an officer is assaulted. I also think it is about making sure that we are training people properly, that we are giving them the right kit, and that we're making sure that they are confident and competent to use it proportionately and in the given circumstances. And what I'm probably a bit nervous about, as the Commissioner, Mark Rowley, said a couple of weeks ago, I think that one of the side effects of some of the challenges that we're currently facing in terms of officers being charged or being served misconduct papers for years and years is that we need to be really, really careful that our officers are not nervous of using the powers that they have to keep our communities safe. So I think that is a particular area at the moment where it is absolutely right that we are accountable. It is absolutely right that we understand the proportionality of the actions that officers in particular are taking. But it is also absolutely right that we recognise that policing is really complex. There are really bad people who are quite happy to hurt police officers and, of course, the public who the police are protecting, and that we need to empower them ethically and with integrity to use the powers and force where they need to do so.
Yeah, very interesting point. I mean, and a very linked thing to something I've seen in the military as well, where I think we have, I'm sure you're suffering from exactly this, the hindsight spectacles brigade, who turn around and look at an event after the fact, whether it's in my old world, a bomb dropped on a particular target for particular reasons, under all the pressure and everything that goes with that, and obviously once it's done, it's done. You can't do anything about it. But then you get the investigation that and the Army have faced this even more acutely, I think, than the Air Force did, where people in contact in absolute life or death situations and make decisions that occasionally are wrong and occasionally are also indefensibly wrong and therefore need to be dealt with appropriately. But most of the time, they're not indefensibly wrong; they're just wrong, and they were made in good faith at the time. And looking at 2020 hindsight does not help. And precisely to your point, what you don't want to get to is a situation where people are scared to turn around and take the appropriate action because they're thinking of the consequences before they've actually taken the action. And I think that's even more appropriate in the police than it is in the military. So yeah, I completely agree with that. It makes absolute sense. I mean, on the challenges point, what else do you see as kind of big challenges? If you cast a kind of crystal ball look forward for 5 years or so, what are you worried about from Sussex Force, but also just generally more broadly?
So we've definitely got financial challenges facing not just our force, but most forces across the country. The cost of inflation and everything that impacts on society, we're not immune to that. And so some of the financial challenges we're facing are quite considerable. I think also the sustainability and the synergy, if you like, of what we want policing to do, and to make sure that we have a bit of continuity in that. So I'm incredibly fortunate that our Police and Crime Commissioner, Katie Bourne, is very focused on victims, on witnesses, on making sure that her plan, which of course I have to have regard to, and I'm very happy to as well, because it is a common sense plan that delivers to victims and witnesses in our communities, but it enables me to be able to then focus my priorities in terms of protecting communities, catching criminals, delivering outstanding service on those areas that we need to do so. What concerns me for the future is that we knee-jerk too much about what those priorities in terms of crimes are, though, as we see other emerging crimes, which we will do through the advent of technology, and whether or not we are agile enough in policing to be able to afford the training actually recruit and pay people enough to want to stay in the police service, because of course the skills that we increasingly need for digital investigation, financial investigation, all of those things are far better paid in the private sector. And so not only do we have the challenge of actually that recruitment and that skilling, we have the challenge of retention as well when people get those qualifications and then get wooed by a lot more money by the private sector. But I underpin all of that with the fact that I am still hugely optimistic about policing in the future, because I do still think that we do police by consent in this country. We still do have the trust of the vast majority of the public. Of course, there are things that we need to get right and that we need to do better, but I do think that we are fit to address those challenges in the future.
Yeah, I think that retention point's a really powerful one. Again, it's a very, very similar one to, I think, anyone in public service, actually. If you look at the Foreign Office, I mean, or Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Offices, it now is a real mouthful now. They used to attract the absolute best people would go into that world. And there's still some really good people that do. But it's a really big challenge to retain them because, when they then look at their friends, by and large, outside in the corporate world, sitting there going, okay, this is financially not really where I need to be. And of course, the trouble is the public sector is never going to be able to match that. There's no prospect of it. So it's about keeping the offer as a whole in the right place, isn't it? For whether it's policing or whether it's, the military or a wider government service. And I think, interesting to your point on digital threats. I mean, I mentioned this AI presentation I was at the other day. I mean, the one thing the guy that was doing it didn't really mention, and I picked him up on it about questions, is the criminal opportunities for some of this. Because actually, when you look at some of the stuff that is being done now with artificial intelligence, it is incredibly clever, but it is also in the wrong hands, you can see incredibly dangerous. I mean, the scope for phishing scams, and when he was interesting when we talked about it, because instead of getting your email from a Nigerian prince asking you for money, it's now going to be something that effectively comes as a voice note from a family relative, and it actually sounds like the family relative, and it's got immediacy and urgency attached to it, and all the rest of it, and it's going to become more and more challenging for sure to weed through that. And as you say, you're looking at people who, in investigating and dealing with that kind of world, you potentially can earn way more by going and working for Google or Microsoft. So I really feel for you. I think it's a tough challenge.
And I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the crimes that we investigated 30 odd years ago still haven't gone away. So those additional ones, as you very eloquently describe, and you're quite right, that future technology has as many risks as opportunities. But, we still do have burglaries. County lines and drugs are still as prevalent, if not more prevalent, than they have ever been. We still have, obviously, all of the violence against women and girls, but also, of course, boys and men, that sexual violence, which is really, really key to making sure that we give that service to the victim. So it's definitely an accumulative workload for policing, and an increasingly complex cumulative workload.
Yeah, well, I for one certainly applaud all you do. I think it's amazing that that you, and as you say, in a resource challenged world, which we all face, and I think it's great to see that you're so optimistic as well, because I think that's wonderful for everyone to listen to. Two last questions that I always ask everybody, Jo. And you can only have one this time, and on the first one of these two. What's the most memorable event of your career / life so far?
I think it is when I was able to get a criminal sexual abuser convicted when they had got away with it for years and years and years and years and years, and everybody, including that person, thought they were untouchable.
Yeah, that would be pretty memorable. How long did he get?
14 years.
Not enough, probably, but there you go. That's another podcast. And finally, then, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
By a victim, why was justice not done?
Yeah, I can easily see that in your case. That would be very tough. Very, very tough. Outstanding. Jo, I knew it would be. It's been a fabulous conversation. Real privilege to have you on. I'm really very, very grateful for your candor and for all of your insights because they're incredibly valuable. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.